Yes, we're open. Living Faith with Needham UCC, a sermon podcast from the Congregational Church of Needham, United Church of Christ, where no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you're invited and welcome. This sermon for Sunday, January 28th, 2024, is entitled, A Teaching with Authority. It's a reflection on a reading from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 1, verses 21 through 28. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to find out more about our open and affirming ministries at the Congregational Church of Needham, United Church of Christ, simply head over to our website, www.needhamucc.org. Thank you. Our reading today comes from the New Testament, from the Gospels, from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 1, verses 21 through 28. Let's listen for a living word from God for us in these words from Mark, chapter 1. Jesus and his disciples went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked them, saying, "Be quiet and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing the man and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. The crowd were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching, with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once Jesus' fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. Friends, God is still speaking to the world and to us. May our hearts be open to listen and to respond. Amen.
Over the course of the four gospel narratives, Jesus performs many miracles or signs, 37 of them by most counts. Everything from walking on water to turning water into wine, to healing a woman with a persisting hemorrhage, to raising the dead, to feeding more than 5,000 people with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And down through the centuries, faithful readers have spent an enormous amount of time and energy, reflecting on these signs, trying to organize and understand them, believe and defend them, and disbelieve and disprove them. Biblical scholars tend to organize the miracles of Jesus across 4 broad categories, something like healings, exorcisms, resurrections, and nature miracles, a more nebulous category, stories of miraculous control over nature like stilling a storm or creating food. Healings are by far the most common, with exorcisms, those times Jesus is said to have driven an unclean spirit, sometimes called a demon, out of an afflicted person, coming second. Though interestingly, the Gospel of John, always the odd gospel out, doesn't mention any of those. Since the rise of the scientific definition of truth in the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries, that has both deepened our understanding of the mechanics of our world and simultaneously flattened our experience of the world. These miracle stories have presented challenges to Christian faith, both inside and outside the church. Some have rejected them as pre- or even anti-scientific, and therefore of no use to modern-day believers. U.S. President and poster boy for the Enlightenment, Thomas Jefferson, famously took a pair of scissors to his Bible in order to excise all those to him unhelpful supernatural elements. Other believers in the course of history, have taken the exact opposite tack. The Christian fundamentalism that began to rise in the late 19th century, itself a reaction against the limitations of Enlightenment thinking, ended up doubling down on those same supernatural elements. These relative newcomers in the nearly 2,000-year history of biblical interpretation came to insist that true Christians take the miracles of Jesus at face value, and only at face value. This has resulted in a kind of equal but opposite flattening of our understanding of not just the mechanics, but the meaning of these miracles. Myself, I find I'm more than a little ambivalent about the miracle stories. You may have that experience too. And if so, that's okay. According to those same gospel accounts, Jesus was kind of ambivalent about the miracles he was performing too. At least in several passages, he seems pretty peeved at our human fascination with miracles. He chastised the religious leaders of his day and even his own disciples. I'm looking at you, Thomas, for demanding supernatural proof of the power of the gospel to change the world, and for not believing the evidence of their own eyes when he provided it. Through it all, Jesus insisted that signs were just that, signs. They were never meant to point to themselves, but rather to point us to a deeper truth, a deeper way at work in the world. Thank you to the ushers. So we're going to go find out which car that is, and we'll go on. Like most progressive Christians I know, I continue to struggle with what to do with these miracle stories, which do seem to be somehow integral to the gospel narratives and the history of our interpretation of them, of him, of Jesus, and his way. I struggle to understand the miraculous, even more the experience of the miraculous, and not to flatten it. I'm grateful for the gifts of reason and science. I am grateful, too, for the gifts of metaphor and more than rational understanding. I also know there are still more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in my or any philosophy. I don't want to deny anyone their meaningful miracles. If the miracle stories of Jesus are important to you in a different way, that's fine, and that's for you. But I also don't want anyone to be denied because they can't bring themselves to believe these stories literally. And I really, really don't want a faith where we are essentially just the appreciative audience for what amounts to a divine magic show. Ta-da! I guess you could say then that I struggle doubly with the exorcisms. These stories, like the one from the Gospel of Mark before us today, where Jesus frees someone from the unclean spirit or demon that is tormenting them. More fundamentalist Christians tend to swallow these stories literally, horns and all. And more progressive Christians tend to reduce them to pre-scientific accounts of persons experiencing mental illness. I say I struggle doubly because, well, in addition to my general qualms about supernatural healing, I personally don't believe in supernatural but somehow oh so tangible entities like demons either. Or the devil, capital D, or angels for that matter, though I certainly appreciate their work in literature, film, and television. Additionally, so I guess it's really a triple struggle, I struggle more and more with the healing stories more generally, and with the problematic way the church historically has theologized people with physical and mental differences and illnesses as problems to be solved. I'm going to pause for a moment. Do we have a make and model? With the owner of the blue Honda Pilot, with license plates starting 162. There we go. Amen. 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 And we'll give Carol a very warm welcome when she comes back. Let's take it back a sentence. Additionally, so I guess it's really a triple struggle. That's where we were. I struggle more and more with the healing stories more generally, and with the problematic way the church historically has theologized people with physical and mental differences and illnesses as problems to be solved. And by the church, I mean me. But thanks to the work of exactly those people, like disabled theologian and disability justice advocate Amy Kenny, I am coming to understand that while a person may have a prayer request, which they get to define for themselves, no person and no person's body or mind is a prayer request in themselves. So what are we supposed to do with these stories? With this story from the Gospel according to Mark, and with all these unclean spirits, these demons? Oddly enough, it's my own ongoing struggles with these stories, or more precisely with the history of the interpretation of these stories, both from the theological right and left, that through a kind of ants in the pants agitating action have moved me to a different way of seeing and believing. Because, friends, I can say now that I do 100% believe in demons. But not like that. Not like in the movies. In addition to whatever may or may not be going on in these stories, I do believe there are demonic forces at work in our world today. But they're not supernatural. They don't come with horns and pitchforks. They're simply inhuman. I believe there are inhuman, anti-human forces, ideologies, systems out there and in here dedicated to dehumanizing those deemed lowest and least, the minoritized and the marginalized. And in treating some subset of us as less than fully human, these demonic forces, in fact, treat all of us together as less than all God created us to be way back in the beginning. Contrary to God's original will, these demonic forces and their witting and unwitting servants seek to cut us off from ourselves, from one another, and from the wider world which God made and pronounced once and for all good. The seamless whole cloth of creation which embodies God's own divine image. We see these demonic centripetal forces at work trying to tear us apart today in our politics, in our legal systems, in our economies, and yes, in our churches and other religious institutions. Anywhere that power over leverages anxiety, fear, and envy to provide unearned and unhealthy privilege to some at the cost of disadvantage to others. We know the list. Racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, poverty, xenophobia, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, colonialism, environmental abuse. Pick a card, any card. They're all in play. These demonic inhuman forces are not new by any means. And still they drive us to act against our own best interests as individuals, communities, nations, even as a species. They keep us thrashing ourselves to pieces, keep us disturbed and disturbing the just peace, the holistic shalom that God intends for all of us all together. And they are devilishly persistent. They take on a life of their own over time so that they no longer need our active encouragement in order to continue, but rather continue to thrive everywhere they are not directly confronted. Enter Jesus. Jesus could see those same inhuman forces active in his own time and place. And he committed himself to confronting them, casting them out, and calling us in to the just, peaceful, and compassionate, divinely humane and humanely divine heart of creation. And he did that, not by appealing to religious or political institutional power, not by dominating others, even for the seemingly very best of reasons, not even by exploiting what some would see as his divine right, his natural, supernatural equality with God as license to enforce that divine will on others for their own good. No, the world-weary crowds in the synagogue at Capernaum would have recognized all those all too familiar power plays. But by their own admission, what they saw in Jesus was a new kind of teaching, a new kind of authority. I believe that what they saw in Jesus was a new kind of connection to the divine author of creation, the Holy One who spoke the world into being at the beginning and who continues today to inscribe the living word, the word of life that really is life, that really is living, not merely existing, that is thriving and not just surviving and only just the life that is love. God continues to inscribe this word onto our hearts, our minds, our souls, our bodies, our own and our neighbors, and even our enemies. And what's more, onto the world around us, the plants and animals, the earth and air and sea, the stars and planets, for the benefit of all. Leaning into his own indissoluble connection with this divine intention, this life, this love, his authority. Jesus looks all the petty demons and demagogues of this world right in the eyes, just like his mother Mary taught him, unafraid, and he refuses to accept anything less for himself or for us than God's full will. His unequivocal yes to God's vision for the world is his unequivocal no to all that diminishes and demeans us or any other, every other. Jesus calls us to follow in his footsteps and confront the demons that haunt us, haunt our minds, our hearts, our halls of power. Jesus calls us to speak truth to power, even if our voices shake. Jesus calls us to cast them down from their false thrones. Again, echoes of his mother Mary. And here's the rub, to do it without ever tearing one another down. But, oh God, that is hard. It is hard to think so holistically. It's hard to call out and cast out our own demons, our own unhealthy ways of relating to ourselves and one another. No wonder then so many of us choose the tiny, private slices of so-called life the lying, demonic powers of this world promise us, even if we know somewhere, on some level, that it costs others theirs. No wonder we keep voting for our own narrow interests alone and against the interests of every other, even the interests of the earth on which we all depend, even though our own best interest is always, by divine design, the common interest, the commonwealth. But Jesus understands what Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and poet activist Audre Lorde and so many other authentic prophets have understood, that the master's tools can never dismantle the master's house, that demonic means cannot ever justify even heavenly humane ends. God's own graceful divine love is for everyone, especially for the people we feel deserve it the least, or it's not really love. And it's definitely not divine. Any authority we claim to transform the world has to look like the Holy One who we claim is the author of life. Or it's just another in a long, long line of petty little demons in disguise, even pretty ones. The world knows that at some level, and we do too. Jesus knows that for sure, and Jesus isn't having any of it. Jesus knows the only real authority against which our actions and our institutions will be judged is love, because love is the author of all. So with surprising force, he says, sit down and be quiet. Time out, he tells us, firmly, lovingly, resolutely. Sit down, be quiet, think again, and try again. Try again. For God's sake, and your neighbors, and your own. Friends, God is still speaking to us, to the world, not just through these words and certainly not just through mine, but through all of creation that cries out for love, justice, and peace.